So I think you'll find that my two discussants have elaborated on these pictures much more imaginatively than I have. I actually have a more straightforward historical interpretation, which is unusual for me. So these are the 5 images. Starting point that I see as a thread going through this is this notion of transfer, and in a very straightforward historical way. But one of the point that I will conclude with has to do with etymology. So the word transfer, of course, comes from Latin root ferro, to carry, and trans, across. Ferro is one of these irregular Latin verbs whose participle is latus, which gives us the word translation. So that there is a close relationship between the idea of transfer and the idea of translation. And it's this that I will eventually come to. So when we think about China, we have this odd thing where, of course, now we think of the country, but of course, for a long time, people also thought of porcelain. These are the same term applied to both, and when one thought of the country, one often thought of porcelain. And Tim Brooke, one of the earlier Reischauer lecturers in his book Vermeer's Hat, points out how so much of people's ideas of the country China came through depictions of China in the porcelain. And in the website that I directed people to, in which I found these images, they say, or the person who put this up, says that this print source remains identified and speculates that this was put on after arrival, and it may have come from this Danish physician. But those of you who study Japan actually will probably recognize that, in fact, this is probably wrong, because that same image appears in Kaitai Shinsho, this work that we've been talking about the last 2 days. This is one of the most famous images in the history of Japanese science. And it's this image that gets embedded in this piece of China. So we have the situation where a German anatomical student manual gets translated into Dutch and then appears in Japan in Kaitai Shinsho. And the same image appears in a porcelain made in China and eventually becomes a British tea set. Now, it's unclear, of course, I don't know, in fact, this might be an interesting project of detective work, what the connection is. It's not clear to me, in fact, that this was put on later. And the very fact that the same image that becomes prominent in Japan gets put onto this British set suggests that there may be some connection somewhere in between. So we've been talking about anatomy the last 2 days, but I want to bring up 2 other sciences, one briefly, the other a little more in detail, that appear around the same time that the original book, anatomy book, comes to Japan. 2 other books are bought by a person named Hiraga Gennai, one of the heroes of Japanese natural history. In 1965, 66, he managed, in the course of 2 years, he managed to purchase 3 books. One is Dodonius's book on pharmacology, one of the most reprinted books in early European natural history. This is a book of pharmacology of herbs. The second is Rumpf's study of shells. And I actually, when I was originally planning these lectures, I was actually planning to talk a lot more about shells because there's a lot of very interesting things around shells. But today I'll only actually talk a little bit about them. And then, of course, Jan Swammerdam's Bible of Nature, that is a study of insects. The one thing I want to mention with respect to Rumpf's study of shells, this is the frontispiece to his work. And Rumpf, over the course, he spends decades, and he eventually dies in Indonesia. And eventually becomes blind because of his meticulous researches. But this is the epigraph underlying his portrait. So Jan Swammerdam's Book of Nature which was published posthumously. It's about 50 years after he actually died. That same illustration gets taken up in one of the early books of introducing Western science and Western culture, more generally, Komo Zatsuwa, published in 1787. And it's that illustration then that gets taken up in popular fiction in 17, it's sort of the, actually I can't remember the exact date of this work, but it's really the turn of the 18th and 19th century, in this picture of a man having this nightmare. So you have Swammerdam's mosquito appearing in this nightmare of a 19th century Japanese fictional figure, along with all these other insects that appear also in Swammerdam's work. So you have a scientific work, it sort of travels to Japan, and not only into scientific works, but into popular fiction. And eventually, of course, it ends up in local fashions. So one of the basic ideas I'm just bringing up is simply this idea of how things travel. Now, who was Jan Swammerdam and why is he important? Well, Jan Swammerdam, as I say, has this influence in various ways on what happens in Japan. This is Jan Swammerdam. Actually, it's not Jan Swammerdam. This is a picture of Jan Swammerdam that was widely circulated. In fact, if you still go to the website for Jan Swammerdam, this is probably the picture you'll see. But they'll tell you that it's actually not Jan Swammerdam. It's another physician named Hartmut Hammarzoon, who actually appears in a different portrait, the famous portrait by Rembrandt. We don't know actually what Jan Swammerdam looked like. He died without leaving any trace. And he actually died of malaria in 1680. But Jan Swammerdam is interesting not only for his incredibly meticulous and virtuosic dissection of insects, but for his philosophical vision of continuity. So he was interested in insects, not least for studying the way in which one thing becomes another. He was arguing against spontaneous generation. He was arguing against sudden discontinuous metamorphosis, and very carefully studying how for example, how the mosquito larvae transforms into full-grown mosquito. He was actually if you read his Bible of Nature, you see that he had quite a playful nature. So he talks about, well, suppose you were to tickle somebody with a feather while they don't notice. They're not paying attention. Then you find that they may scratch themselves. They scratch themselves, and all of a sudden they find, after the fact, that they have a red patch. They don't even know why they have the red patch. The stimulus of the feather has set off this chain of reactions that results in a red patch, of which the person, him or herself, can't explain. Since David Howell showed the cat, this is just another example of the kind of thing that Swammerdam talks about. This kind of thing which Swammerdam talks about is actually tremendously important in the history of science. And Swammerdam, in my view, is actually really a critical figure who hasn't received as much attention as he deserves. Because he's the first person, as far as I can tell, who challenges this idea of voluntary motion. Indeed, he challenges the very idea of agency. So from very early on, from the time of Galen in the 2nd century, there was the idea that human beings are animals with agency. That is, that we decide to do something and we can do it because we have these things called muscles. Swammerdam says, well, let's look at these things like the way the cat will react even while he's sleeping, or whether the way in which you can stimulate a frog's leg even after you've dissected it, and it will contract. And you see that, in fact, there's no decision at all involved. It just happens because of the external stimulation. And Swaminathan speculates that maybe everything is like that. So he comes up with this idea that there's this endless chain of causation. So the usual explanation for, say, that A may be that it's caused by B, and that's where we stop. But Swaminathan says we shouldn't stop there. We should keep going back to what causes B, and what causes C, and what causes D. And then, in fact, it goes on forever. And in fact, nothing emerges out of nothing. That you can keep going back and endlessly. It's, in fact, a view that's quite similar, I think, to Buddhist ideas. In this endless chain of transformation, what is it that really endures? This picture of the ambassadors has been endlessly and justifiably endlessly commented on. It's a beautiful illustration with enormous detail. And if you look at the detail of this, you can see some of the commentators have read the particular sightings of this and read meanings into the particular configuration of coordinates that are suggested by these instruments. There's a great deal of science in these pictures, as well as a great deal of precision. If you look carefully, you can see that the lute string is broken, another reminder of vanitas. But as I've tried to suggest in earlier lectures, it's precisely this realism, this hyper-realism, this attention to detail, which is also a reminder of the impossibility of ever really seeing everything. And so, of course, the crux to this painting is that everything that you can see in detail is actually not the essential thing to see, and that you have to look from the side to see the one thing that's prominent but easily overlooked. And this, of course, is very similar to the Vesalian picture of the skeleton at the center of the illustration, but which everybody in the crowd somehow misses. This idea of what's apparent and what's not, what's visible and what's not, and between reality and appearance is, of course, one of the central themes that recurs in a realistic view of the world. So this is the famous Bach triptych, which shows John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene. But it's a three-part folding structure. And if you would flip it around, the back of John the Baptist is a skull. The back of Mary Magdalene is a cross. So again, it's always this sort of reality-appearance dichotomy. And the challenge is always to show that there's always more to see. If you look closely at this detail, you see a little skull. And as you would have been able to see if you followed up on Rebecca Lemoff's arrow, in the corner you see a crucifix. Now, what I want to do today is similar to what I did yesterday, which is to suggest that this paradigm of the apparent and the real, the visible and the hidden, to which we're all accustomed, is not the only way to think about and only way to respond to this problem of a world that's changing and difficult to grasp. The dichotomy of the apparent and real may fit neatly with the traditional epistemology of the observed and the observer. There's other ways to think about the situation. And I want to begin by an example from one of the works that was inspired by room study of shells. And it's called Hachimokufu. It's one of the early natural studies of shells in Japan. So why is this work called, mokachifu? Why is this called mokachifu? First of all, it's sort of a pun based on the characters. You put together the two parts of the I and the 8, and it creates the character for shell. But it's also part of an expression called okame hachimoku, which we might translate literally as the clairvoyance of the bystander. And it's a term that goes back to the game of Go. So okame means sort of the bystander, the person who's kibitzing. And hachimoku means 8 eyes ahead. So if you know anything about the game of Go, there are these things called eyes, which are sort of the places which you try to gain, and these are the places which are alive. And the idea is that if you're not playing the game, you're able to see 8 steps ahead. You're sort of able to sort of see what the actual players of the games can't see. Again, it's this idea that people who are directly involved often miss what's really important. Now, what do we see in the Yojo Kagami? It's a work that's incredibly rich in detail. And it's a detail that's pretty fun. It's the inside of the body. And here we are sort of wandering around. This is the heart. Here are the lungs. And the picture seems to exemplify a comic version of anatomy. And an excellent example of the human body as a mirror of the social body. There's a spleen. But if we actually look at this picture in detail, we learn something else. So there's the inside of the body with all these very interesting characters, almost like comics. And then there's the outside. And this, if you don't read Japanese, it looks pretty much the same. But if we look at the outside of the picture and actually read the text, we discover something quite striking, which is that this part of the text, this is a description of the heart, is written in literary Japanese. It's the naribun, nani nani nari. And it's in fact a direct quotation from the Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's Classic of Medicine. So it's not playful at all. It's serious medicine. So this work is not simply a comic book, a work of comic entertainment. It's designed to convey real information, real science about the body. Similarly, if we look at this section of the female figure, on the one hand, we have all these people chatting and saying sort of amusing things. This is these two women having this conversation about orgasms out of childhood. The other one says yes, but, oh, sorry, I've got this spelled wrong. But the other woman says, once you get old. But at the same time, we see, for the first time, these illustrations of the ovaries and the fallopian tubes. So sort of anatomical structures that were totally absent in traditional depictions of the body. So the point is that these are, in fact, conveying serious information, but at the same time, joking around. And it's this juxtaposition, I think, that's really quite fundamental to thinking about these illustrations. So what I want to suggest is that we may have to think about alternative visions of translation. The common view of linguistic translation, and of course there's a huge amount of literature on translation and cultural transfer, goes something like this. Basically, Japanese woman looks at this word dog, doesn't know, but then say, okay, dog means inu, right? Oh, dog, right? So the idea of translation is you replace a foreign word with one word that's familiar. And of course, all the difficulties and sort of slippages that often that involves. But what I want to suggest is that what these pictures relate to is another possibility. And I want to focus on this phenomenon called furigana. That is, instead of replacing one word with another, the idea is juxtaposing a foreign word and a native word and putting them together. So who in this audience can read this word? Oh, we have lots of. What is this word? Seishin, okay. This is, sorry?
I said, I'm sure it's going to turn out not to be Seishin.
Yes. Well, so what do you think it is? Jingshan.
I have no idea.
So this is, again, a serious work of regimen. This is not a comic work at all. So you have the Chinese term. This is, for those who don't know Asian language, this is the Chinese term. And then what you'll have is what's called furigana, which teaches you how to read that term. In this case, the Japanese reading says, okay, I'm writing these characters, but you should read it as kokoro, which means heart. Right? But in this work, that's not the only way he does it, the only time this term appears. In other places, he'll have the same characters, and he'll say, read this genki, which means vitality. Right? So he's using the same visual symbols, but telling you to read it in a different way, which gives you a different meaning. Right? Elsewhere, he reads it as tamashi, meaning the soul. Right? So we're not quite sure what the word is. I mean, that is, whether we're supposed to focus on the character or the reading. Undoubtedly, we have to think about both together. But the point is, he's not just translating by replacing a Chinese term with a Japanese term. He's putting them together. And in fact, sometimes he'll take the same word tamashi and replace it with a different character. And I want to suggest that this kind of transposition or juxtaposition that you see in furigana, it offers an alternative way to think about translation, indeed an alternative way to think about communication. So here, for example, in Utamaro's insect book of 1788, we have a very realistic, naturalistic depiction of insects. But this work appears in actually what is a kyoka collection, that is a collection of so-called crazy poems. Poems that are deliberately, sometimes called comic verses, deliberately subversive. And so what I want to suggest is that we may want to think about the possibilities inherent, offered by juxtaposition, and this combination of the seen and the heard together, and this juxtaposition. So that this plus sign, the way in which these two get combined, in the case of juxtaposition, leaves a space of distraction and play that offers us a freedom of communication that, in fact, enhances communication in ways that probably haven't been fully explored. And that the way we might think about juxtaposition is the way we think about movie scenes and the soundtrack, sound and image in soundtrack. This is how I suggest that we look at the Japanese image of the serious content. This appears again and again. You have serious content and then somewhat comic pictures, where you have Chinese characters and you have furigana that don't quite match at all. In fact, you constantly have to sort of adjust. And what I'm suggesting as an analogy at least for discussion, is that it might be worth thinking about this as analogous to the relationship between a movie, visuals of a movie, and the accompanying sound. So what would I like you to remember from these lectures 25 years from now? First, April 10th, 2013, that you began thinking about distraction. And hopefully, whatever else you remember from these 3 days, that you'll remember thinking about distraction, that you won't think about distraction in the same way again. From the first lecture, I'd like you to remember the idea of skeletons and life, life with a capital L, life that is not the difference between the opposite of death, but somewhere in between life and death, as symbolized by the skeletons. From the second lecture, I'd like you to remember the vision of the looker, or looking at lookers. This alternative to an epistemology which is based on this dyadic relationship between the observer and the observed, but one which takes into account the possibility or our attentiveness or distractedness that's created by the observation of other people observing. And from today's lecture, I'd like you to take away this notion of juxtaposition. Juxtaposition particularly as exemplified by the soundtrack and the visuals of a movie, and in concrete form, exemplified by these kinds of pictures which look purely entertainment, but in fact are designed to convey actual science. So thank you very much, and we'd like to proceed to the discussions.